Focus today is on energy policy. It comes amid various developments, including a warning from the energy market regulator to Victoria that the closure of the Hazelwood power station in the Latrobe Valley will have ramifications for energy security, and not just in Victoria, but South Australia as well. I spoke to Josh Frydenberg, the Energy Minister, about a range of issues, including whether or not the government was wrong to blame renewables for that South Australian blackout last year.
Well, let's be very clear that the Prime Minister, myself, other ministers and government members all indicated that what precipitated that blackout across the state last September were these extreme weather events, more than 80,000 lightning strikes, 1 in 50-year storms. That sent a surge across the interconnector. The interconnector couldn't cope. The settings on the wind farms weren't appropriate and they couldn't ride through the voltage disturbances, whereas the thermal generators could. But while all that occurred because of the weather events, what made South Australia so vulnerable was its heavy reliance on intermittent sources of power, particularly wind, but also solar.
So this advice that was sent to the Prime Minister's office in the wake of that storm is incomplete, is that right?
No. That advice is totally consistent with the points that we've been making about how the South Australian blackout was precipitated by a weather event, but what made the South Australian system a lot more vulnerable was its heavy reliance on intermittent and unpredictable sources of power. You see, even just last week.
So just to clarify, the cause you're arguing was the storm, as reported by Mark Kenny today in the Fairfax papers, but it was exacerbated, the impact, because of that state's reliance on renewables. Is that a fair way to characterise it?
Well, without the heavy reliance on renewables, the South Australian system wouldn't have been as vulnerable as it was. Now, for example, the interconnector supplies brown coal-fired power from Victoria into South Australia. You wouldn't need an interconnector if you had your own sufficient baseload power in South Australia. Now, because of the high uptake of renewables, we saw the Northern Power Station close last May. That produced more than 500 megawatts of power, at times up to a third of the average demand in South Australia. If that hadn't closed, you would have had baseload power and you wouldn't have had the blackout.
Well, so let's look then. All right, let's look then to this warning about Hazelwood closure risking blackouts. This is the advice now to the Victorian government. The Hazelwood station's closing though, as of the 1st of April. So this is all a bit too little, too late, isn't it?
Well, obviously the Victorian government has a case to answer here because they tripled the coal royalties on the brown coal generators in the Latrobe Valley. This hit the bottom line of the owners of Hazelwood. They were very open about that. They said this did not create a very conducive economic environment for them. In Victoria, they've also pursued a 40% renewable energy target.
But that's fine, you can blame them, but what happens? This is now a greater risk of blackouts in Victoria and South Australia.
Yes.
People don't want to just hear the blame. They want to know, what are we going to do about it?
Well, we're absolutely focused on working with the Australian energy market operator to stabilise the system. Now, one of the things that we can do is to reduce the reliance on the interconnectors going into South Australia. We can get more thermal generation going in these states. We can make a very strong case for more gas into the system, a very strong case against these state-based renewable energy targets. And today, Kieran, my coalition colleagues at a state level in Queensland, South Australia and Victoria have all stood together and say they will not adopt these Labor state-based renewable energy targets. That's very good, and that will also help provide a more certain environment for future investors once they get to government.
Yeah, that's fine if they get to government and there's an agreement on that, but this is all longer term. Hazelwood shuts down on the 1st of April. This has implications not just for Victoria but South Australia as well, according to the regulator. What can be done? Can that station be kept open for longer?
Well, look, we're talking to the market operator, but it does have ramifications because Hazelwood will go, and Victoria, as a result of Hazelwood closing, Victoria will go from being a net energy exporter of power at times of peak demand, being a net energy importer. So the really difficult period will be in early 2018. That's when the points are for peak demand, or late 2017. So this is an urgent issue, and we'll be taking advice.
And at the same point, like we saw, that instance with Pelican Point, it doesn't look like the system's running as smoothly as it should be, like in that blackout last week in South Australia.
Well, what happened in South Australia last week?
And that's with the energy that we do have.
Yeah, what happened in South Australia last week was that we saw in the one day a 95% drop in the amount of power being supplied into the grid by wind. So at the time of the blackout, only 2.5% of South Australia's power was coming from wind generation. This was extremely problematic because the interconnector was already working at full capacity. Until we get the storage and the technology that can help us ride through some of these difficulties, we're going to have a more unstable system in those states with high uptake of renewables.
Minister, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Good to be with you.